Account Manager for Health, Safety and Environment, and the PCB's organizer for this session. Today's topic is ISO 40001 2015 version, and its integrity and implementation and auditing in the new EMS standard. We will cover how ISO 40001 has created new opportunities for consultants and auditors, and how it has improved into practical EMS with clear scope and expectation. To talk about this and much more, joining us is the PCB's Certified Trainer and Managing Consultant of Aquagem Environment, Mr. Cecil Corloncito. Feel free to write your question and comments in the question box in the right-hand control panel, and Mr. Cecil will answer to them accordingly. Moreover, if you want to participate directly in the discussion with our presenter, you can also raise your hand, and then we will unmute your microphone and you can make your questions directly to him. Mr. Corloncito, you may start the presentation.
Hi everyone, my name is Cecil Corloncito, and thank you for the opportunity for listening on joining this webinar. This is regarding ISO 14001-2015, the integrity and implementation and auditing of the new EMS standard. I would like to introduce myself. My name is Cecil Corloncito. I'm the Managing Director of Aquagem Environment Limited, based in Australia, Melbourne, Australia. I am a chemical engineer by profession. I also hold Masters in Environmental Engineering from the University of Melbourne. I also hold Certificate in Training and Assessment from the Victoria University, and I'm a Certified Lead Auditor for ISO 9000, ISO 14000, and OSHA 18000, and a PECB Certified Trainer. I was one of the pioneers of ISO 14000 way back in 1996. I participated in providing comments to Technical Committee 207 for the current ISO 14001-2015 and the future ISO 45001 on occupational health and safety management systems, which is expected to replace the OSHA 18001 standard. As I mentioned, I'm an ISO 14000 certified lead auditor and certified trainer. I was a consultant of ISO 14000-2015, of the first organization, one of the first organizations to be recommended for certifications only 3 months after the release of the new standard. I have helped the first environmental regulator in the world to certify to ISO 14000. There is a clerical error. This is the original one, which is ISO 14000 1996. I helped the first province in Asia to certify to ISO 14001 in 2000. Helped the first and medium enterprise in the Philippines to certify to ISO 14000 in 1997. Since living in Melbourne, I have contributed to Melbourne's accolade as one of the most livable cities in the world for 4 years in a row, when I was with EPA Victoria as a senior assessor. I also defended as an expert witness in the Supreme Court case of a landfill in Manila Bay. I strongly believe that integrity and impartiality in audit is non-negotiable and paramount to the success of any country in adhering to international standards. So let me start the presentation by showing to you the new standards. And by the way, Aquagem Environment is based in Australia, as I mentioned. We are a PECB partner since February 2015. We also design water and wastewater treatment plants, and we develop individuals and professionals and environmentalians in their business development, especially on environmental management. ISO 14001 is the latest, was the only standard which was released in 2015, in September 15. Its title is still the same, Environmental Management Systems, Requirements with Guidance for Use. It was first published in 1996. The second release is still current, and industry can still use it, which will last until 2017. The third release was September 15, 2015. This is one of the most successful environmental management system, or one of the most successful management system standards, adopted by more than 300,000 certified users in around 155 countries all over the globe. This is the ISO 14000-2015 model. There's a quite, difference in the model because it used to be like a process where there's a continual improvement, but this one follows exactly the plan to check act process. If you imagine that this square is the locality where you're locating business and this circle is your business, then the model would show that you have to consider the internal and external issues, the needs and expectation of the interested parties in order to understand the context of the organization and design and that should be the design basis of implementing an environmental management system that the organization should be able to deliver the intended outcomes of the EMS. So this is the new model. Let me discuss about the clause number 4, which is titled Context of the Organization. This is a new clause, and there is a key insight to this new clause. It is sort of very high level, and this describes or define the boundary and the scope of the EMS in an organization. This is where, when there is a need to define or to determine the internal and external issues of the organization, and this is also where the views or the needs and expectation of interested party has to be identified. This is high level, and there is always a conceptual understanding of this clause, and it talks about the main focus, which is the environmental responsibility. Why I'm trying to devote more time on this, because clearly says that this is a high level, a conceptual one, which is the basis of designing designing the EMS based on the 2015 version. So, contrary to what I have currently or recently experienced, where there were some comments that there should be a detailed, not conceptual, but detailed way to do a risk assessment on this process. There's nothing in the new standard that says that there should be a risk assessment methodology. However, if you look at the planning stage, there is a clear requirement that a methodology for environmental aspects and impacts identification and evaluation has to be established. So that is one of the reasons, but based on this context of organization clause, the standard did not really look at a risk assessment methodology, although it has been mentioned that a risk has to be identified, but there is no such thing as a methodology that has to be specified. The standard did not specify what kind of methodology has to be used. So I'm stating that here because that would set the pace on the proper implementation based on the new standards, and also when auditing comes for potential, internal audit process and the certification. So these are the 10 main clauses of the standard. The blue, highlighted in blue are the one really that I would say that is auditable. The scope, the normative references, the terms and definition are there, but I don't see that they are auditable. So these 10 clauses are going to be compatible with other management system standards like the quality management systems, which was released on 15th of September last year. It has exactly the same clause. The upcoming OSHA or the ISO 45000 has the same clauses, number of clauses, which from 1 to 10. So I'll go directly to the topic because there are so many clauses, but I have to go into clause 9, which is the focus of this discussion. Under clause 9, it's called performance evaluation, and under 9.2, subclause 9.2, it's called internal audit. These are the requirements of internal audit. the organization shall conduct internal audit at planned intervals. There's nothing new to this. This should be the audit should conform to the own requirements of the EMS and the requirements of the standard. It should be effectively implemented and maintained. Internal audit program has to be established and maintained, including frequency, methods, responsibilities, planning, requirements, and so on. These are not new. These are the same as the previous standard. However, I would like to emphasize that the internal audit program shall define the audit criteria and shall select auditors and conduct the audits to ensure impartiality and objectivity of the audit process. So even in this particular internal audit process, I, as a consultant, not as an auditor, so to try to ensure that even the internal audit process is going to be impartial and objective. For example, when we select auditors and they are the one auditing the whole organization, who audits them? Who audits the auditors? So I have made, we have to struggle in the design to make sure that it depends on the size of the organization. But we have to struggle, I have to ensure that the impartiality and objectivity, the independence of the audit process is to be done, meaning you cannot audit your own work. If you are auditing, you cannot audit your own auditing work. So the internal audit process should ensure that the results of the audit are reported to relevant management. The organization shall retain information as evidence of this audit process. Now let me touch to you about a topic which is going to be very interesting. I've learned about this topic way back in 2000, and it still is very clear and vivid to my mind because this has been a question for so many people. What do you mean by audit and what do you mean by assessment? So this is my simple interpretation of this, which I learned, decades more than 1 decade ago. It says, and I quote, assessment is based more on professional judgment and less on criteria. Like criteria would be the basis, like for example, ISO 14000 standard. That's you're doing more of an assessment. An audit is based more on an audit criteria and could be less on professional judgment. So if I'm going to demonstrate this in a graph, so if a person is doing more of a judgment and based on his intellect, based on his experience, based on the knowledge of his work and his previous, education and his basis or on his own intellect and judgment and experience, then that person, if he's doing and not using any basis except for his own judgment, that person is doing an assessment. However, if that, and maybe using less of a criteria, because that's more of his intellect, his experience, his qualification, his knowledge about the industry and so on. But if a person is doing more of a basis, has used a basis of making a call or making a decision, so he has a criteria, and that person could be doing an audit because he uses a criteria. So that criteria could be used like the ISO 14001 standard. So ideally, this is the situation, but I would say that in order to make sure that we align to the audit process, then we have to exactly know what is the basis of doing the audit. So the audit is more of a criteria, while doing an assessment is more of basing it on his own intellect, knowledge, and experience. So this is how we're going to look. This is what is my basis of looking at the whole picture of doing audit and assessment. When doing work at the EPA, I was basing my work based on my judgment of my previous experience. However, I could be used to doing an audit based on the interpretation of the Environment Protection Act or the law or the policy. So the best way to do both audit and assessment is you are in the middle and you are able to assess based on your experience. At the same time, you have to base that on the law, then you will be doing more. A strict auditor based on the law should be only be basing on the requirement and criteria of the law, regardless of what his judgment, what his findings are. So that is what I'm presenting this to you to give, you know, a background of where am I coming from when it comes to some confusion, some strategic decision on auditing and assessment. So let me proceed with ISO 19011. The ISO standards for certification audit is called at present ISO 17021-2015. This is the requirements for certification body providing audit and certification of management systems. This is where the basis of certification, this is the standard 17021. The other one is ISO 17024. This is a conformity assessment, a general requirement for bodies operating certification of persons. So if you are training persons for becoming certified auditors, then you base this under ISO 17024. So the ISO 19001 introduction says that there is such thing as internal auditing, which is sometimes called first-party audit, external auditing or supplier auditing, which are called second-party audit, and the external auditing process or the regulatory auditing process could be a third-party audit. So under this 19011 requirements, I would be touching only on the principles of auditing and the competence of and evaluations of auditors. So I'll touch first about auditor competence. Auditor competence, the auditor should be able to determine, the evaluation process of auditor should, the process should determine the competence of the audit people or the personnel to fulfill the needs of the audit program. So then the auditor competency should involve evaluation or establishing the criteria, so the audit basis, and the selection of the appropriate evaluation method and conduct of the evaluation. This is evaluation of the process. This is about auditor competence. How do you achieve auditor competence? So this is just standard, requirement, formal education, training that covers generic skills, experience, exercise of judgment, decision making, problem solving, audit experience acquired under supervision of auditor, the same as in the same discipline. Auditors should have generic knowledge and skills in audit principles, procedures, management systems, reference documents, organizational context, applicable legal and contractual requirements. Auditors should have also sector-specific knowledge and skills, including discipline on specific management system requirements and principles, legal requirements, interested parties, fundamentals of discipline and sector, knowledge of sector and nature of operation, risk management principles. There is also a requirement for audit team where knowledge required should include knowing about environmental terminology, about EMS audit, environmental metrics and statistics, measurement, science and monitoring techniques, interactions, environmental media, air, water, land, flora, and fauna techniques in determining risks, which are aspects of important life cycle assessment, especially in the new standard it says about life cycle assessment, then environmental performance. Specific knowledge also is required for pollution prevention and control, source reduction, waste minimization, recycling, treatment, hazardous waste, greenhouse gas, and so on and so forth, including environmental design. reporting, product stewardships, and others. Now, these are some of the auditor personal behavior that is, I would say, a must. An auditor should be ethical, should have fair, sincere, and honest and discreet in his, disposition of the audit. An auditor should be open-minded, willing to consider alternative ideas or points of view. Auditor should be diplomatic. He's using a basis, but he should be tactful in dealing with, different sets of auditing, different sets of people. Auditors should have a skill to be very observant, actively observing what's going on within the surroundings and the activities, and trying to connect that to the ongoing audit process. He should be perceptive, aware of, and be able to understand situations. Versatile, he has the versatility to able to adapt to different situations. Tenacious, he should be strong, persistent, but focused on achieving the objectives of the audits. He should be very decisive, able to reach timely conclusions based on logical reasonings and analysis, self-reliant, able to act on functions independently while interacting effectively with others. So those are very important auditor personal behavior necessary to conduct and to follow the principles of auditing. Now, what are the principles of auditing? According to the standards that we mentioned, ISO 19011, ISO 17021, there are 6 principles of auditing. The first principle is, of course, the integrity. This is the foundation of professionalism in doing impartial audit. Integrity, this should be based on sound, unbiased, and ethical way of doing the work. The integrity is listed as number 1, and I think this is the highest form or the most important, one of the most important principles of auditing. Fair presentation. There is an obligation of the auditor to report truthfully and accurately. So it means that an auditor should be free from any bias at all, any intent, any pecuniary interest, to ensure that when he made the presentation of the report, it is truthful and it is accurate and it is to be very logical to the results or the actual findings or the evidence of the audit. The third one is due professional care. There is this application of diligence and judgment in auditing. You have to be, an auditor have to be prepared. In this busy world, there are so many works of auditing or auditors, but yet you need to be diligent enough to prepare and ensure that you will be able to deliver the judgment in auditing in a very professional way. You should be able to prepare and understand what is the basis and what organization, what kind of activities the organization you are going to audit. And you need some support in case you lack knowledge and experience about that organization. That is about due professional care. The third one is confidentiality. Whatever you have discovered in an audit, it remains to be very confidential, and that's one of the most important aspects to ensure the security of information gathered during the audit process. The fifth one is independence. This is almost interlinked with the fair presentation and the integrity, but it says that the basis for the impartiality of the audit and the objectivity of the audit conclusion is the total independence of an auditor. So it means even in an internal audit process that you cannot really audit your own work. We struggle to do that in an internal audit process but I don't see a reason why an external auditor would not be able to practice independence in order to come up with impartiality of the audit and come up with the objectivity of the audit conclusion. So the independence is very, very relevant, very important. And the last one is about evidence-based approach. The rational method of reaching reliable and reproducible audit conclusion in a systematic audit process. So you don't use your judgment because this is what you believe. You have to use evidence to come up with an audit finding. You don't use what you are very passionate in a particular situation, like you're passionate in doing risk assessment methodology and insist on it, but you must be doing an evidence-based approach while conducting the audit. So an audit finding would have an evidence, and that evidence came out because there was a requirement of an audit criteria, and the audit criteria is the standard. For example, if the standard says that the organization shall develop or shall evaluate environmental aspects and evaluate its impact, so the organization cannot comply with the standard if he doesn't have an evaluation or a documented evaluation to show, even if it's as a simple, is this risky or not, simple yes or no, is an evidence. But in order to pursue further, then you must be able to come up with some data and information to ensure that your finding is very clear and evidential. So those are the 6 principles of auditing. Let me share to you the potential breach of this auditing principle, which could happen and have happened and could happen also in the future. Let me cite you some case, for instance. A top management have directed an organization that they should be certified to ISO 14000. The EMS consultant had recommended to implement ISO 14015 version. After 5 phases or several phases of development, the consultant had helped the organization in selecting the certification body for accredited certification without even directly dealing with the certification body to maintain the impartiality and avoid influence of the outcome of the audit. The certification body's local auditor have conducted a pre-assessment, which is not really part of the audit proper. If you remember what we mean by assessment and audit, the local auditors, this could be their strategy to come up with pre-assessment in order to help the organization. That would be fine. That's being done by so many organizations to come up with some help on pre-assessment, but that is not part of an audit proper. It's an assessment. It's based on intellect, based on knowledge and experience. The auditor have issued a professional judgment during the process and required the organization to conduct an environmental risk assessment methodology using the authored methodology because the auditee cannot explain its own methodology. While it could be a very good finding in an assessment, but to demand for doing an environmental risk methodology, much worse if it's coming from him, is something now tilting into the fine line of what we call impartiality in auditing or independence in auditing. How can one introduce a methodology and still become an auditor of that kind of methodology in the future? Instead of the organization correcting the issue, the auditor have conducted training on how to use the risk assessment methodology. Upon learning The consultant advised the auditee to inhibit the auditor in conducting the certification audit, to let other auditors do the audit. However, the consultant have advised his client that the consultant would not, that could be a potential breach of the auditing principle, and consultants would say that should not be part of, should not be included in the audit process. It could be a potential breach of the auditing principles. The certification body was advised but has denied that the auditor has violated the principles of auditing and will only replace the auditor if the client will request it. The audit schedule will be delayed if the auditor will be replaced as per the certification body. The organization has decided not to replace the auditor. The auditor in question had conducted the certification audit. The organization was recommended for ISO 14015 certification and was awarded the certificate. This process of certification and accreditation has a potential breach of the auditing principle, but can be repaired through another impartial audit free from any bias or ethical questions. Breaching the principles of auditing may not be a violation of any law, but the integrity of ISO management system certification will affect the industry standing in the international and business community and the host country in itself. So those are just the whole story. My question to you, if I list down, what is your conclusion of what had happened? Let's look at again the principles of auditing. Was there really integrity? Was the audit was fair and devoid of bias? And was it ethical? There might be some question of the integrity. When the auditor tried to present a solution finding, was there going to be a fair presentation to follow the obligation to report truthfully and accurately the result? Due professional care. Did the auditor apply diligence and impartial judgment in auditing his own methodology? Confidentiality, maybe there's no problem with confidentiality, but this should be like security of information. There could be no problem with that. Independence. Did the auditor conduct the impartiality of the audit and the objectivity came up with being objective of the audit conclusions? Evidence-based approach, but to conduct rational, enriching, reliable, and reproducible audit conclusion in a systematic audit process. So those are the questions that I would like to ask to you, because I think that we need to make sure that with these new standards coming in, the 2015 version standard, this is going to be an opportunity for consultants and certification body and auditors alike to come up with, to conduct the specific rules and responsibility, and to make sure that the line, the fine line between auditing impartiality should not be breached. So I am asking you the question with the hope of making sure that hopefully in the future we should be able to come up with a more, the highest dignity and integrity in auditing process. We know for a fact that auditing is a work, this is a skill, and this is also a business. Consulting also is a skill, this is a business, but we know the rules of engagement. There are 6 principles of auditing that has to be followed to the letter. And I personally believe that by doing this, we should be able to maintain the highest integrity of ISO management system standards, especially when the new standards now has required new requirements that would enable everyone to conclude what is required, what are not required, and in order to harmoniously and uniformly come up with a solution, we should be able to identify, are you doing an assessment or are you doing an audit? So with that, I would like to thank you, and I hope that I was able to present to you, to everyone, a perspective, or I would say a process of improvement for the future. So with that, I would like to end my presentation and hope to hear questions from your end. If you are going to don't have questions now, you can send it by email, or you can send me a message to LinkedIn, to my Facebook. But we still have, few minutes or 5 minutes more to go. I can entertain some of your questions. Thank you, and have a great evening from Melbourne, Australia.
Mr. Cecil, thank you very much for this great presentation. We actually have some questions we would like you to answer. The first question is, will the audit to the new version of this standard trigger additional audit time?
I am not going to be answering that if it triggers additional audit time, but if you are an existing ISO 14000 certified and you want to align to the system, I think there is an additional requirements, especially on the clause 4, which is the context of the organization. Originally, or currently, the 2004 version requires identification of aspects and impacts, and if you have significant aspect, then you come up with policy and you implement with environmental objective. This one, the basis of implementing the new system is different. Instead of environmental aspects and impacts and its significance, it requires the identification of internal and external issues, and it requires also the identification of the needs and expectation of interested parties. So to answer that question, I think if you are an existing ISO 14000 certified, yes, there is an additional one, but if you are not, you are starting to implement the system, I don't see an additional basis of auditing in this process.
Okay, thank you. The second question is, based on your experience, what are the most common problems that may come up during the auditing process?
Well, that's a very good question because I just have experienced that one. From the auditing point of view, being a consultant, the most difficult aspect here is how to inculcate the requirements of, for example, doing a risk assessment methodology. The risk assessment process is the heart and foundation of doing an environmental management system, because that is the basis of selecting significant environmental risk and doing action towards that, determining the risks, the threats and opportunities under the new system. That is one of the hardest part. And the second hardest part is about everybody being aware. Even the old standard, everybody has to be aware and to be competent and to have training on the things that they're doing. That's the same as before. The hardest part here, as far as this topic is concerned, is the internal auditing process, where how can you come up with, it depends on the size of the organization, an independent and impartial internal audit process. So the way we do things is that we select auditors, but we have the foundation of saying we should not, an auditor cannot audit his own work. Although still you're part of the team, yet you still exert independence. My biggest experience and issue arising from the new system is the interpretation of the consultant of the requirements and the interpretation of the external auditor of the requirements. Now, I don't see, I have experienced a lot of auditors being asked about what to do when there is a finding. An auditor should not be giving recommendations strictly, but auditor always provide generic kinds of recommendations. Now, if the standard is not asking for that requirement, but the auditor is doing like requiring that requirement, maybe based on their own internal certification body requirement, then there comes the issue of of the client or the auditee, which one to believe. The consultant have developed the strategy for the last six months or 5 to 6 months, and the auditor would come into the picture and say, this is required, this is not required, and this is required. So the solution to that is it really required by the standard? So if it is really doing good for the organization, then the organization should decide, yes, we want that. But if it is going to be imposed by the auditor that a certain particular methodology of doing risk assessment has to be done, then as a consultant, it is going to be like challenging what the consultant was trying to teach to the client. And I think that kind of action by an auditor is keen to an abuse of discretion of an auditor. An auditor is not going to find fault. An auditor should help. But to impose something and to tell something wrong, and to also offer the solution, and much worse, to say and to tell them how the solution has to be done, and later on he's going to do the audit, and that is one of the areas that I think is going across the fine line of the independence and impartiality of auditing. So the most difficult aspect under the new standard is how we should be able to align consultants and auditors alike, how to align to the common understanding of the requirements. Of course, the auditee is going to be a victim of this, because once the auditor says these things, the tendency for the auditee, yes, we have to follow the auditor, yes, we have to follow the auditor. Now, that sometimes is at the expense of the consultant. So the auditor would have a feeling, oh, the consultant was not doing it right for us. In fact, when the consultant was strategizing that work for the last 6 months, and it is going to be destroyed by one comment of auditor in a one hour meeting, but he is an auditor, then there's something wrong. So I think that is one of the most difficult aspects of auditing. But because of the principles of auditing, the 6 principles of auditing would be the guiding principles of doing these things properly, especially when the new standard is coming out. And this, I think, personally, I believe that this is now one of the best environmental management system standard that came out from way back in 1996. This is one of the best. That's it, Sana?
Yes, Mr. Cecil, thank you once again. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I would also like to thank all the attendees for taking the time out of their busy schedule to join us. We hope you enjoyed this webinar. We received all of your questions, and because the time is limited, we will answer to your questions individually by email. Also, don't forget to check PCB's webinar schedule on our PCB's official website and also on the other social media network. See you next Friday. Bye-bye.
Thank you.